everyone, this is Kestrel. I'm just getting set up at my new corner here, new desk. It's a little wobbly, but still good. So, we have a lot to talk about the state of the world, the economy, and coronavirus. So, let's dive into it. So, I've got two things. I've got a drafted script to read, and I also have the latest Imprimis from Hillsdale College. I know it's reversed right now, but the title is 4 Months of Unprecedented Government Malfeasance, written by Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute. So, I did mention that I took a trip to Hillsdale College to attend the anti socialism seminar last November, very early November, the first week. I had a great time there. If you are thinking of going to college in the state of the world these days, maybe next fall, I would very strongly recommend Hillsdale. It's small, it's out of the way, it's patriotic, it's Christian, and it's wonderful lectures, wonderful experience. Liberty University is another possible one. I have not personally visited there yet. That's another good one, and perhaps Grand Canyon, although I know less about that one. But, all right, let's dive into this. So, when the Chinese Communist Party let loose the COVID-19 pandemic upon the world, they decided not to inform the world, and there is sufficient evidence that that they were in fact aware that there was human-to-human transmission as early as last November or December, which they told us they did not know that there was no human transmission. That was a blatant lie. Of course, what do you expect from communists? But that is the very threat. They denied that anything was wrong, covered up all information related to the new coronavirus, scrubbed the lab in which it originated, scrubbed it clean, and disappeared, meaning killed, anyone who tried to warn the world about it. There was a young doctor who tried to warn the world about it with a wife and children, and he was killed very early on. Hong Kong tried to warn the world what China was up to. Taiwan tried to warn the world what China was up to, taking gigantic amounts of economic and military risks. But since Hong Kong's rule under England ended in 1997, and England foolishly gave Hong Kong back to China, not wanting the trouble of having to deal with the now decades into evil communism Chinese regime, and all of the backlash they could receive from going into that battle, China had been infiltrating Hong Kong's government throughout the years since, to the point where it was almost impossible for what should have remained a free living Hong Kong people to fight the communist takeover by any means other than guerrilla warfare, which may go on for decades, or who knows how long. Hong Kong tried for many months and years to deter the Chinese Communist Party with peaceful protests, actual peaceful protests, not the riots and burnings and lootings that the U.S. Mayors and governors call peaceful protests, which they're not. But Hong Kong did actually try to fight the communist takeover by peaceful protests, peaceful marches, waving the greatest symbol of freedom the world has ever known, the American flag, hoping that America would come to their aid. And we damn well should have. Some of us very much wanted to. China wasn't having it, and because from as early on as the 1920s, 100 years ago, communists in the United States setting up of socio-political tensions in whatever way they could, getting men and women against each other and opening the door wide to no-fault divorce and the destruction of the stable family, setting up the welfare state that tells who would have been working adults, many of them now single mothers in the Black community first, other communities later on, later moving on to the white community, and I know it's even starting to go on in the Asian community. So the welfare state tells these single mothers they don't need to work, they don't need to keep a husband, they don't need to work, they can just live off the government, which is not an honorable way to live. Government will take care of them. Yeah, well, setting up the false accusations of systemic racism, when in fact Americans throughout the 20th century became less and less racist each decade. It set up anger and hatred at capitalism. The socialists and communists in America had also infiltrated the United States government to a huge extent, and certainly the universities and schools largely. I was in kindergarten in 1990, and I remember singing patriotic songs, sang great songs about America. And that was even true in 2000. So I don't know at exactly what point during these 20 years that became looked down on. During a lot of the mid 2000s, about 2008 to 2016, 17, I was out of commission. Long story. But, and so it's tough for me individually to tell exactly where it happened, but it's not a good change. What people need to understand, and fast, is that the government is not their friend. The government is not your friend. There is this video from a scientist from Hong Kong, Dr. Li Mingyang, who was studying the COVID-19 coronavirus. She reports that by December, there was already human-to-human transmission of the virus, which the Chinese Communist Party, again, said there was not. Now, I saw this comment, interesting comment from someone named CB, I guess that's initials. Also, interestingly, there seems to be essentially a hyper-inflammatory response later on during the infection, which is what happens when our immune system is over-responsive. In fact, sometimes a better immune system can be a harbinger of worse disease, not necessarily death. Cancer and immunosuppressed patients are not actually faring as badly as one might expect. Oh yeah, so this was interesting about what happens when you actually contract the virus. What we have seen is that contractions are rising across the world, except for a very few places that did very fast, very on-site targeting. Hong Kong is one, although of course they have to deal with the communism virus. But it does seem that when you have a lot of people contract this virus, eventually what you have is the population developing antibodies and a resistance to it, which is actually a reason why people should go out and start living their lives again. You expose yourself to more pathogens, you'll actually get a resistance for a lot more. This is why kids from homes and families that keep a lot of animals, from farms, from places that are not spray cleaned everywhere, actually have far less allergies because they're exposed to much more and their body can get used to that. And this COVID-19 really seems to be most deadly for the 65 and older. I believe the average age of death is actually 80. So that is and most other people who get it will be, it may be some trouble. The younger you are, the typically more you resist it, aside from a very rare few cases. There are a couple of young people that have died, but not very many. Uh, Actually, barely any at all when you really look at the numbers. And seems to be a death rate of all in all about 3 in 1,000. That's actually quite low. So there is no reason for shutting down our lives anymore. Now, I've been working this entire time because I needed to get on a job and I'm willing to take the risk. But a lot of people have been. What the government did is that it wasn't technically the virus that shut down economy and shut down jobs. It was the government coming in and saying, we're gonna forcefully shut down everything. And that destroys people's livelihoods, even people who would have been very willing to take the risk of, a little bit more exposure, maybe do some precautions, but we need to keep working. We need to keep our livelihoods. We want to keep the jobs and the businesses that we spent our livelihoods leading up to. We'd be in a much better position had we not shut down. Oh, so about immunosuppressed people not actually faring as badly as one might expect. Well, one reason for that might possibly be that immunosuppressed people, because they are a little more vulnerable to diseases than other people, the immune system they do have wind up having to fight off more, and so they actually become very good at fighting because they have to fight quite a bit with a lot less to work with, so they become better at it. That's possible. I am technically immunosuppressed, having had 3 organ transplants over my early decades. Actually, pretty much just savaged my formative years, which still comes back to haunt and hurt me quite often, but it made necessary due to a very obnoxious genetic illness I was born with. But at the same time, I've other than that had a very strong resistance to contracting additional diseases. It's mostly that just caused a whole lot of residual problems. And my body is surprisingly good at recovering from injury. Again, perhaps because it has had to survive with a smaller tool set for healing itself. And so, in a sense, it turns what tools it does have from being specialized chisels into figurative Swiss Army knives. It's actually quite possible. Now, as to the factor of money and finances, there was a caller into Ben Shapiro's show who mentioned that she was let go from her job, as many people have been, or have had their jobs just shut down forcefully, completely. I really think we got to take that power away from government because it's been wielded completely irresponsibly. Um, we'll read a little bit of this, Imprimis article in a bit. So either her company had to downsize in these over-restricted times, or because she bravely refused to bow to woke activists. She didn't specify which reason, but she got a stimulus check from the government to tie her over for a while, saw that it was more than she expected, which likely means it was money to try to hush her up. And she called into the Daily Wire asking, where's this money coming from? Which is a reasonable question. In the opening to the 1993 movie Free Willy, right before the opening music plays with the killer whales playing, which is really the film's best music and not the Michael Jackson song at the end, but that's beside the point for the moment. Right before the opening scene, there's a Native American proverb that says, "We have not inherited the earth from our ancestors. We have only borrowed it from our children." And this can be applied to many aspects of life in which the vision of the long road is a good vision to adopt. It's the same in the situation we are now in with spending money. All of the stimulus checks that have gone out during this pandemic, no matter which country you live in, pretty much every country on earth was already in debt to begin with. The money being sent out by the government is money borrowed each week, or maybe even each and every day now, from another generation in the future. It's actually an extremely immoral thing to do because we are stealing from our children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, and so on and so forth down the line. To how many I don't know how many generations now. It's countless. But most people have lost the principles of do not buy what you cannot afford, do not indebt your children, grandchildren, and so on. And the government, of course, doesn't care for the principle at all. In fact, the government is happy to pretend that moral values does not exist, at least in this context. It absolutely exists. And here's another important question to ask. Where does the government get all its money? The government makes no money of its own. That is very important to understand. It produces nothing, it builds nothing. People in the government are mostly all talk and write and lecture and campaign and fail at fulfilling promises while they shut down citizens' lives if that's the easiest way to avoid any criticism and be allowed to stay in their comfy government chairs, offices, personal mansions. People in government take their money from taxes and donations. None of it is money they made with their own labor. The big mistake that socialists make, and intentionally because they all want a comfy seat in government themselves with everything handed to them, is that they argue to corporate hierarchy. They argue that corporate hierarchy and a system of working your way up through achievements of merit and accomplishment, hard work and planning for the future, keeps the working class suppressed or oppressed. The reality is, it's the reverse. It's the government and the destruction of supportive, stable families that keeps people living paycheck to paycheck in the condition of squalor. The real culprits of tyranny are not companies or the system of merit, it's the government. The government and its idiotic and irresponsible management of everything politicians get their sleazy hands on is always the problem. We would all be much better off with a tiny and very weak-ass government. And at the same time, strong work ethics and strong families. Talking about my home country for a moment, the USA, before the state governments began the COVID-19 lockdowns, the earliest of which began around the middle of March, before that we had the vast majority of working age population at work or actively seeking employment. I myself was actively looking for work until the end of February, where I finally got a job offer from SwageLock and spent the month of March going through all the paperwork and background checks, agreements, and finally moving to a new address to start on the job. And I've been working ever since, 40 hours a week. I work at a factory that turns raw metal materials into parts for essential medical, technological, and military machinery. So it's an essential occupation. We make the parts for the advanced machinery. With most working age adults either employed or actively searching for employment, the government shutdowns began when we were in the middle of a thriving economy and just forcefully shut that down. The government really has way too much power and way too much cowardice in it. Before the lockdown, we actually had the possibility of beginning to pay back all the debt we had accumulated over the decades. We had become energy independent, despite all the criticisms and attacks that fracking was getting from environmentalists, which, as an ecologist, I believe was unfounded. The shutdowns killed that. And now the borrowing money from the future generations, which is unjust and wrong. You can do it in a true crisis for a very short time, but not for long. And this has already lasted too long. In the beginning, we were told we're going to do maybe 15 days, maybe 3 weeks to uh, not to crush the curve, but to flatten the curve of coronavirus contractions and deaths in order to avoid the hospitals becoming overwhelmed. They're not overwhelmed. And the federal government gave hospitals the ventilators, the equipment that they needed, that they asked for. We're not overwhelmed. So it is time for the shutdowns to end. This was never going to be a crush it all until there's a vaccine. That's completely, that's about as unrealistic as you get. Because what if a vaccine comes out, but it only is about 50% effective? Or what if 50% of the people don't take it? Can you really force the people to take it? Not really. At least I damn well hope not, because if the government does force people to take it, then we are in a communist police state already, which at that point, it's time for another counter-revolution. Truly, if you listen to the numbers of trillions of dollars the government is borrowing now, that's what's unprecedented. Not the government malfeasance. The government has always practiced malfeasance. It's always been idiotic and irresponsible. Uh, so Heather McDonald's article begins with public officials' overreaction to the novel coronavirus put American citizens into a coma. Well, cities. It says cities, but cities and citizens into a coma. That's true. Those same officials' passivity in the face of widespread rioting threatens to deliver the coup de grace, basically the killing blow. Together, these back-to-back government failures will transform the American polity and cripple urban life for decades. Yeah, I don't know how long uh, this economic death is going to go on. We'll have to work back up to prosperity for decades now, all because of a few months of overreaction. Before we were moving along towards paying back some debt, we had a truly thriving economy. See, a lot of people don't quite understand what the economy is. The economy isn't just money exchange and profit. The economy is literally people's livelihoods. It's the exchange of goods and services. It's trade. It's supply lines. It's food supply. Uh, it's retail. It's everything that keeps money and resources flowing between people, and prosperity even possible. That is what the economy is. It's not just numbers. I mean, you can write it in all just numbers, but that's not what it represents. It represents livelihoods. And the result of the lockdowns and distancing and more intense public health measures applied, all of those have extremely mixed results. It's actually looking like the states with the strictest lockdowns were also the hardest hit in terms of coronavirus contractions and deaths. So the science is, and I know the media likes to uh, misportray science and all of that. Science should drive our policy. It's not what's doing it. It's political infighting driving our policy. I've heard very few people talk any real science at all. Even Dr. Fauci came out and said, uh, New York did it wonderfully. New York did it correctly. New York basically wiped out their elderly population. They had like 1,000 people dying a day in New York. They did not do it correctly. They refused to protect nursing homes. They refused to protect uh, subways or come out with a different strategy for subways. Completely refused to come up with any intelligent plan whatsoever. So now everyone's lost their credibility as far as I'm concerned. The actual sciences, as dissatisfying as this may be to hear, the science is actually inconclusive. There's not conclusive evidence that masks work. There's not conclusive evidence that social distancing works. There's not conclusive evidence that the lockdowns do a damn thing. In fact, they seem to be counterproductive because they trap people in their homes, basically shut them out from their livelihoods, shut them out from their purpose and quality in life. And of course, when you're sitting at home all the time, you get fat and lazy, and that becomes once you sink into that, once you begin to sink into that, it's hard to break. It's really hard to break. And we cannot continue to deprive people of social and physical closeness for much longer. Humans as a species, and we all know this deep down, we do not fare well when separated from each other for very long. The mainstream media, which is completely in bed with the radical left, the disintegrationist Marxists, to put it fully honestly, tells us over and over that it has the definitive answers to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, when in truth, nobody does. Again, the science at this point is inconclusive, and the very effectiveness of basic precautions such as social distancing and everyone wearing a mask, which we cannot continue forever, are unclear. Some studies suggest these do help to slow the spread, while others suggest they do almost nothing at all. Testing can be increased, but it's not prevention, and there is no vaccine yet. Virologists are working to try and develop one, likely exhausting themselves working overtime to try and develop one. It still may not be developed for years yet. That's a very real probability. Governor Cuomo of New York failed to do so much as draft policies for protecting people while riding on the subways and in nursing homes, both of which needed top priority protection. Yet the mainstream media treats him as a genius that did exceedingly well. I already mentioned this. Dr. Fauci said as much, which means he's lost credibility. When in fact the virus already killed most everyone it was probably going to kill in New York, which sounds like a terrifying lot, like the Chinese Communist News asking Xi Jinping how he did so well addressing the coronavirus crisis in his country, where the virus was developed and released from, and the Chinese Communist Party just disappeared everyone who criticized the CCP or tried to ask questions. And I have even heard, I need to look into this, but I have even heard that bubonic plague has re-arisen in China. It actually originated from there hundreds of years ago. But the Chinese Communist Party doesn't care. They can just kill all the people they want. They're communists. And this is the threat of big government. I was watching the 2000 movie The Patriot last night, and the early part of the movie, there is a gathering in Charlestown, South Carolina, where the main character, who is not an actual historical figure, he's a conglomeration of several, but it's a very good movie. He wants to avoid going to war with the British Empire because he's tired of the horrors of war and has a large family to care for, which, why should I trade? Okay, he says this quote, would you tell me, why should I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? An elected An elected legislature can trample a man's rights as easily as a king can. Now, here in America, which should be attacking China with all of its might in retaliation for releasing the pandemic virus, economically, if not militarily, we'll see. The threat larger than the legislative party are the judicial and executive branches of government. Actually, they've been way overbloated. Actually, all government has been overbloated, but those a bit more uh, damaging. A lot of power has been given away to uh, to the judicial and executive and centralized government overall the last several decades, but the spirit of the quote still applies. He's very right. Um, you get a bunch of people in government, each with only a little bit of power of a king. They collectively can do just as much or even far worse damage. The last gigantic communist country, the Soviet Union, collapsed in 1989 when I was 4 years old. And its collapse continued on through the 1990s. And now Russia is finally nationalistic and Christian again, which America would do much better returning to its roots of the virtues of self-reliance and Christianity again. But the Soviet Union did not have the technological and manufacturing power that today's communist China has. And China is a threat to the world far greater than the Soviet Union, even at its peak. There is a movie titled Mr. Jones. Actually, there are a few different movies titled Mr. Jones. You'll have to read the synopsis before finding the right one. That tells of a journalist reporting on the Soviet Union who finds out it was not the workers' paradise the Communist Manifesto promises. It was a hellscape where people were either murdered or sent to the archipelago of gulag torture prisons on any charge the government wanted. This is what any and every government will become and turn its nation into a torture prison state once it has grown large enough. And this is what I fear America becoming if we don't fight hard to push back against government growth and take over people's lives and livelihoods. We have got to push against them. The government is not your friend. If freedom of speech, property rights, the right of the assumption of innocence and until proven guilty, and the freedom of private enterprise are all fully surrendered to the government will not serve as a friendly parental power with the purpose of taking care of you. It will become a predator of its own citizens, silencing and disappearing any brave enough to speak out or against it. And the moment you realize that your life that once had the right to pursue and earn happiness is gone forever, and are angry about this, the government will have its own definition of taking care of you. The government is not your friend. It is a bad-tempered, over-bureaucratic, power-glutton mafia that only cares about maintaining its comfy position and mansions of power. It will take everything from you if you don't fight back against it. Right. Well, I've spoken for a while. I will read more of this article in the next video. This goes into talk about a lot what I did talk about. So before all the riots and lootings and burnings that occurred all over the U.S., Minneapolis was the first. There were actual peaceful protests of people standing outside government buildings and offices, holding signs saying lines like, "Coronavirus isn't going away, but our jobs are." Very true. A lot of people's jobs went kaput because the government came in and forcefully shut them down, not doing any real scientific assessment of the actual risks and rewards of dealing with this, of how to deal with this coronavirus. This is not the only pandemic we'll ever be faced by. This is not the only pandemic the world has ever seen. There will be another. Are we going to even have the possibility of dealing with another? When it comes, what if another comes in a couple of years? What about that possibility? The government forcefully shut down the exchange of resources to a large extent. There's some people who never stopped working in the grocery stores. A lot of people never stopped working in the hospitals. But those people are exhausted. They have been putting themselves at risk every single day. Some manufacturers are still working. Some businesses did start to reopen in early May, but not enough. Not enough to revive the quality of life that we had before all this. And what did the government say? What did the government and mainstream media say to the people who said they wanted to go back to work, that they will take precautions, but they need to go back to work, they need to earn their livings again? Said, you're killing your grandparents. Don't you care about don't you care about other people, pretty much, which I gotta tell you, I really hate. The government is not doing any risk assessment, maybe a little in the federal government. The federal government and Trump administration did give states the ventilators and the supplies they needed, and then Trump mostly left it to the individual governors and mayors to figure out, which would have been a good strategy if a lot of governors and mayors knew a thing about what they were doing, or took any time to try and reasonably assess the situation. The politicians' ignorance about the complexity of economic life was stunning, as was their hypocrisy. Every elected official, public health expert, and media pundit who lectured Americans about the need for an indefinite lockdown had a secure essential job. Really secure, not essential, because them barking at us is not essential, but it's a secure job. Not one of them feared his employer would go bankrupt. But a lot of us are afraid of losing our livelihoods. A lot of us have lost them. I don't know how we're going to recover from this, but we're going to have to find a new tactic.